I think the focus on quality content first, where content or stories that are human are never really going to go out of style. And whether or not we deliver it through voice narratives or through some kind of different algorithm in the future, it kind of doesn't matter. We'll find out whatever is the best venue to serve is telling that story in the first place.
Calibration is locked and normal. Diagnostic underway.
Streaks of color dominate the scene. The carefully drawn movements depict supersonic motion. The protagonist's intent is clear. As your eyes scan to the bottom page, there's a violent transfer of energy captured in a freeze frame. A swift punch lands a devastating blow on the jaw of a dark, unsightly villain. For those unfamiliar with the world of comics, this scenario, one straight out of our youth, is what we know best. A superhero narrative, or even one of the Sunday funnies, is something that most have become accustomed to. But for a growing crowd, there's a much more layered and fascinating view of comics that's looking for respect. A quote by Jonathan Hennessy raised a great point about comics. He says this: "It always strikes me as supremely odd that high culture venerates the written word on the one hand and the fine visual arts on the other. Yet somehow putting the two together is dismissed as juvenilia. Why is that? Why can't these two forms of art go together like music and dance?" Comics deserve a new lens that isn't overshadowed by its past formats. And a growing segment of that world is graphic medicine. In its simplest form, it is medical subject matter told through comics. But don't think for a second this is illustrated cold prevention tips you'd find in a pamphlet at the doctor's office. The following story contains strong language, so if you're listening to this in an open environment, consider putting on some headphones.
My name is Ryan Montoya. I'm a family medicine doc. I trained in Massachusetts, and I focused on opioid narcotic dependence. And at the same time, I'm also a comic book artist and have worked professionally in the industry for a few years and sort of getting back into it right now.
Deconstructing the established structures and legitimizing comics is no easy feat. You're bringing together two seemingly unconnected worlds.
The combination of being a medical doctor and a comic book artist tends to throw people off. One of the most awkward questions I get, which is the most common question when you first meet someone, is, what do you do? And just depending on who's asking, I will either explain my entire story, which can get very boring, or I'll just give the answer, just a doctor or just a comic artist, because I feel like explaining the connection between the two is pretty strange.
Commercial juggernauts such as Marvel and DC's movie franchises reinforce certain stereotypes, but bringing into the mix an innately more serious topic such as medicine changes the whole discussion. It's about the possibilities of storytelling and more than just good versus evil. The strength of comics lie in their ability to create imaginary worlds and further convey thoughts and action through metaphysical scenarios. The written story within comics is not to be overlooked, and it serves as a holistic storytelling experience. And together, both words and visuals have the ability to convey immense emotion and meaning in a synergistic fashion. Tackling graphic medicine is simultaneously challenging and disparate, because the very idea of combining medicine and art brings forth two conflicting schools of thought.
They're very disparate fields in most ways because medicine is very dogmatic. You go to medical school, you are taught how to do things. You may explore and kind of innovate in small ways, but to be honest, medical doctors are the mechanics of science, okay? They are doing a lot of the grunt work. If the human body is a car, they're the mechanics, whereas science research, these are the guys who are innovating and coming up with new ways or new instruction manuals. So it's a inherently uncreative field, in my opinion, whereas in comic books, it is inherently creative for a number of different ways.
Overcoming or understanding the first hurdle of disconnection leads us to the actual creation of art. To Ryan, comic books might suggest an over-reliance on the artist's drawing abilities, but the key trait is really how you're able to tell the stories.
To me, the only price of entry to enter graphic medicine or to enter the comic book field in general is just to be a good storyteller, and that's it. For better or worse, you don't have to be a good artist. I think a lot of the mechanics of comic book art are lost on some independent comics, but all you need to do is to be able to tell that story. So whether or not it's a medical provider telling it or a patient telling a story, all that matters is that they can tell the story well.
There's a further example of how a great primary physician interacts with his patient.
If you're a good primary care physician, you can tell a story and you can tell it at any level. You can tell it to another colleague in a matter of 2 sentences. You can tell it to a patient with less jargon in a matter of 10 minutes or an hour or however long it takes to get that story across. So to me, the storytelling aspect is very similar.
So where does graphic medicine come in? It's a further way to explain situations and scenarios.
The idea of illustrating what is going on where people might not understand it otherwise.
Graphic medicine is a relatively new arm of comics that was coined by Ian Williams in 2007. It was conceived as, quote, the intersection between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. It came onto the scene after Williams recognized the potential of comics in the field of medicine. American comics have largely been perceived to be something for adolescents. They're something that people are expected to grow out of.
Okay, here's my offer. All this primo crusty merchandise for that copy of Radioactive Man vs. Muhammad Ali.
My counter offer, Radioactive Man meets the Kansas City Royals.
With blockbuster after blockbuster filling theaters, it has further led comics down a very particular path. Graphic medicine has never quite had the commercial legs of your prototypical superhero-based comic. And further, their position as part of the realm of underground or independent comics have made it a struggle.
The other side of that has always been non-superhero comics in the US called independent comics or underground comics. And to me, those have always been good. And I think whether or not they're having a resurgence, I don't really know. I think that the audiences have always been smarter, and I think they've always had more to say. But because of this dichotomy between superhero and non-superhero, it creates market forces that almost never favor quote-unquote independent comic.
Small victories have emerged from the underground scene, however, and many fans of the genre are hoping that these victories will propel them towards larger audiences.
You think about some of the most well-regarded independent comics in history. One is Mouse, which you may have heard of, by Art Spiegelman. This is a comic book detailing the artist Art Spiegelman and how difficult it was to survive what it was like living with his parents who were Holocaust survivors. And, you know, this got a Pulitzer Prize. Everyone who loved independent comics was like, yes, we're finally legitimized. Like, this is it. Like, we will no longer be considered the bastard child of like comics and literature, but we still kind of are. And the same thing goes for another great comic, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, you know, critically received very, very well. And then there was this impression that we had broken through.
These wins have barely moved the needle. Instead, graphic novels and the like are still seen as more art-based initiatives.
The breakthroughs are probably not necessarily going to be in this generation. I think people who love comics will still make them no matter what, but I don't see independent comics as actually having any kind of resurgence. I think they've slowly and steadily done their thing, and they are, for better or worse, going the way of traditional publishing. So any ups or downs that traditional publishing of paperback books or hardbound books that's the way independent comics will go as well.
The battle to legitimize these types of comics dates back to the late 70s and the work of an underground comic pioneer, Will Eisner.
What happened in comics in the US is they started growing up a little bit in the late 70s. In 1978, there's this, maybe the most well-regarded comic artist of all time. His name is Will Eisner. Invented what was called the graphic novel.
For Eisner, the graphic novel was a pushback against how comics were seen at the time, a format and medium seen as disposable. Comics had gone through difficult times.
They've gone through a lot of rough patches where they're always and perennially considered a lower form of art. I would hardly consider anyone who's a comic artist to think of themselves as fine artists. So because of that, there's always this context of comics being put in newspapers or in dailies or comic strips as kind of throwaway fare. Get them done quickly, get cheap laughs, and move on to the next serialization.
Eisner's introduction of the graphic novel or graphic narrative was helpful as a new marketing tool.
And the idea was he was tired of doing strips. He wanted to do a long-form story that was self-contained. And he invented the term graphic novel to describe it because he wanted to say this is a different form of comic books. But really, it's just comic books, and he just wanted them to be taken more seriously.
It removed the obvious angling of a Sunday comic, and it also enabled other branches, such as graphic medicine, to use it as a springboard towards greater credibility.
A graphic narrative is basically a comic book most likely about someone or something that's real. A graphic memoir is just a comic book about yourself, and graphic medicine is just comic books about medicine, all right? If I'm being completely cynical, it's a great marketing tool, and it's just a great way for publishers to dig into a niche where they would never get any market traction if they were just saying, we're pitching a new comic book.
The idea of a graphic medicine novel has its purpose in creating a new movement, and it disconnects itself from any previous connotations.
They say we're pitching a graphic medicine novel or something like that. It sounds new, it sounds exciting, and it's a great way to kind of wrangle a lot of comics that have existed for decades that were about medicine, but now are just finding this umbrella term to reside inside. So basically just any comic books, whether short or long form, that have anything to do with medicine are considered graphic medicine.
The concept of storytelling beyond just graphic medicine can take several different paths. Understanding how it can be used isn't about narrowing your perspective and honing in on a particular category.
The best way to describe it is this is a book or a comic book form of an online support group, okay? If you have Lou Gehrig's disease, and there are actually a few comics about this, and someone illuminates or illustrates the story in a way that you can relate to, that is the true value, I think, of not just graphic medicine, but comics in general. And that's something that I think probably provides more value to readers than any kind of instruction manual comics. Not to deride instruction manual comics, but there just don't seem to be that many. And I think that's what tends to be more compelling is a patient's experience or being on one side of the medical provider's table and how scary that can be, how fun that can be, how terrifying it can be, etc.
The genre of graphic medicine is something that has a lot of room for interpretation. An author has the ability to manipulate the page and to create their definition of scale, perspective, and time. This is a very important tool, often unseen in other creative storytelling mediums.
What makes comic books and graphic medicine within comic books so unique as a medium is the format. And we'll limit this discussion at this point to printed comic books because I feel like digital comics is a whole other kettle of fish. But there are things that can be done in comic books that cannot be done in literature and that cannot be done in movies that are specific to comic books. And so if you look at that layout of a page, physically, what you're seeing is unlike anything else in storytelling because, you look at the layout of a written page and sure, you'll see different paragraphs. You'll kind of see overall what the structure of it looks like.
There's another added element to comics. The story's next developments are teased the moment you flip the page.
Comic books deal with time in a very weird, specific way to say that when you first look at the page, visually, you get a sense of what is going to go on before you even start looking panel by panel. And then the way you design a panel, whether it's long, short, squat, whether it's completely contained or broken open.
These tricks change the dynamic between the reader and the author. You're no longer stuck in a predetermined format.
These are ways to express how the reader is supposed to interact with that scene. So if you have tons of words and the word balloons are crowding around a central character, then that speech is supposed to be suffocating that character. And then if you have completely wide open panels with no words at all, this is a very quiet kind of contemplative scene. These are things that, sure, you can have movie scenes where the same things are happening, but you really can't express it visually the same way because you're always bound by the same, whatever, 16:9 ratio you have of a movie screen. You are not bound by that in comics.
It's this unique relationship of words and visuals that can be a powerful tool in telling stories that other, arguably more popular mediums can't tap into. Graphic medicine allows one to distill a core message, and that can often be at war with one's emotional distress, such as a life-altering diagnosis.
Medical comic books have the ability to kind of demystify medicine because they are immediately easier to understand than being given sort of didactic instruction or advice from a doctor. For instance, one of the hardest speeches to give to a patient is if they have some sort of terminal illness or some terminal diagnosis, and you give them some basic timeline of how long they have to live. One of the phenomena that we are taught, and which unfortunately many people experience, is when you get that diagnosis, you have cancer, you have terminal pancreatic cancer, and you have 6 months to live.
After hearing this type of news, you're often reeling from the effects. The dialogue that proceeds doesn't register as the emotions dominate any sort of objective thinking.
There's this very real effect of every other thing that I say afterwards being kind of muffled out. It's like the Muppets where you can't even hear what I'm saying, all these technical words afterwards, and you do not hear a thing. And it's because A, the terms afterwards are very hard to understand, and B, you are still experiencing some other piece of information.
This is a place where graphic medicine can come in and be a great resource.
If graphic medicine or comic books can even physically slow down time by saying, okay, here's something that you can spend as long or as little time as you want reading, that in and of itself is a value greater than if you just bring a tape recorder to a doctor's visit and you just keep replaying the same words over and over again and you have no clue what the doctor's talking about.
In even more complex causes that speak to highly specialized fields of medicine, Ryan shares some anecdotal experiences. It's a further area where graphic medicine can come in and provide clarity and understanding in moments when patients are otherwise confused and scared.
If you talk to a specialist, they are trained differently and they have a completely different point of view and a different perspective. But the problem a lot of times with specialists, and I'm not saying every single one, but a lot of the ones I've worked with, is they have no fucking clue how to explain what is going on to a patient. Now, a lot of specialists are incredibly intelligent people, and they're so stuck in to this. I mean, like, you have certain types of vascular surgeons who work on only one type of blood vessel in the body of the hundreds of types of blood vessels, okay? When you're stuck into that field, how on earth are you going to explain it to a patient? Some super specialists can explain it to patients, but most cannot. And I think if you're a good primary care doc, you should be able to explain anything to everyone.
From Ryan's perspective, he expands on his approach towards graphic medicine. There's a goal and a desire to humanize the patient-doctor relationship.
My philosophy towards creating comic books that would fit in the category of graphic medicine is I believe most of the stories have dealt with what it's like on one side of the exam table, which is to say, a patient experience, what is it like to receive medical care, to get shitted on by medical care, to have a disease ravage your body. I wanted my comics to be almost exclusively an explanation from my point of view, what it was like specifically to train, how difficult it was, and how if you see a doctor at a certain point and you think you had the worst interaction ever, it was almost certainly as bad for the doctor as well, but for completely different reasons. And so I wanted to do it from that point of view, mess with the illusion, this kind of paternalistic figure that doctors tend to be in a relationship, kind of break down that wall. It's, you know, in the 90s, they had this terrible Fox show, Magician's Secrets Revealed. I think it was funny because all these magicians are like, what the fuck are you doing? You're ruining all the magic. I still think there's that attitude with a lot of doctors, like, this is what we do, like, you just kind of take our advice. And to me, I think comics could be a great way to break down that relationship and say, this is what is actually going on. It may, or hopefully will make people feel uncomfortable because you realize just how close we are to the edge or just how far we are from the real answer. And I think that's a really compelling story to tell.
A well-oiled, commercial, superhero comic machine is based on a factory model, and each step is overseen by separate people. But when it comes to the realm of graphic medicine and underground comics, the individualistic nature of the craft is in itself a struggle.
There tends to be in American comics, in American superhero comics, this factory model, this assembly line model, where you get a script from some writer. He or she may do breakdowns of what's going on in the story, and then you translate it as an artist into some kind of thumbnail sketch. You go over dialogue, and then usually if you're just a penciler, you'll do the pencils, someone else will do the inks, someone else will do the color, someone else will do the lettering, and you put it all together, you package it, and you send it off.
And with a smaller production, such as a graphic medicine novel, there isn't such a luxury of having more help available.
Because they are almost all quote-unquote independent comics are generally done by one person. And they suffer the same problems that, let's say, a movie-making auteur would have. So let's say you have a writer, director, producer like M. Night Shyamalan, or well, let's think of a better example, like Paul Thomas Anderson, right? Who writes and directs his movies. He has the problem of whether he wants his writer side to take over, whether he wants his director side to take over. I'd say that's a problem, not just of graphic medicine comics, but of any independent comic.
There's different levels of complexity at hand here. The one-man show allows an individual to know every intricate detail and thought that makes it from mind to pen to paper. But it also creates internal strife between whether the visual or the written side should take over.
If you have a writer, artist working on a single comic, the biggest issue that I believe artists face is, I want to write something to express this story, but I also want to draw something. And which side takes over? Do I leave one in the back burner while another one takes over? And it's always a struggle. Like, each panel is a struggle about whether or not one side is going to take over the other. In terms of the technical aspects of making comics, I think they're all the same for graphic medicine or superhero. You know, writing, drawing, and putting it all together tends to be the same physical process.
Ultimately, a successful graphic medicine story doesn't come down to just great writing or visuals. Authors are meant to create a narrative that should bring the reader through a series of emotions. Sometimes for a reader to not fully comprehend or be explained a topic in full has a powerful place in the story.
If a graphic medicine novel is attempting to open up a bridge between patient and provider, or to explain what it's like to have acute kidney failure, and it does it well, then it's done its job. But if the intention of the author is to say, no, this is supposed to be confusing because fucking kidney physiology is so confusing, and also doctors don't know the answers, then if it's done well, the reader should hit that wall. The reader should say, oh my God, this is just as confusing to me as it is for the medical provider. And I believe that if any literature is done well, if any comics are done well, if any movies are done well, it's done to accomplish whatever goal the author had set out to in the first place.
With further insight into what purpose graphic medicine serves, it leads us to wonder, what's the next step for this unique branch of medicine and art? To understand medicine requires an undeniable foundation of knowledge. Yet health and medicine relate to everyone's lives.
It's an interesting question whether or not graphic medicine is having growth or whether or not it's kind of reached its limit or its cap. I don't believe it's reached its cap as long as there are stories to tell from healthcare providers or from patients' families' perspectives. That's a well that I believe will never run dry unless people stop getting sick.
When left with the question of what's the future of graphic medicine, Ryan doesn't deny it's peaked, but he wonders the economic sustainability of the medium.
The idea of using an umbrella term like graphic medicine it's gaining some traction in the sense of like people are more aware of it on news outlets and on social media, but the way it's still presented is, like I saw some articles recently and it was like, bang, pow, kapow, comic books aren't just about superheroes. They can be about medicine too, right? And it was like, Jesus Christ, I think I saw that exact same article in the 90s. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that they've capped in terms of their trajectory, but I think it just means that the interest in this being seen as an emerging field may run out before they're able to get as much money as possible from publishing.
We cannot separate health from humanity. As long as discoveries are made and experiences and interactions with medicine occur, graphic medicine will continue to have a place.
Once the trendy phase of it passes away, the stories will still be there. The comics will still be there. People will still, it's like an impossible force to stop where people will still make comics and then maybe it just won't be called graphic medicine anymore. I wonder about whether or not it'll still be termed that way, but I think the comics will continue to be made forever.
We can't currently say that graphic medicine is a widely adopted part of media. To understand its impact is still yet to be fully understood. But understanding even just a small instance of how this type of storytelling improves lives is a start. Ryan leaves us with a moment when this powerful storytelling tool had its impact on both his comic and medical career.
If I were to be truthful about what has impacted me the most about graphic medicine, it has been when I've been able to read other people's stories. So as a creator, I love it to create this stuff, but then also as a creator, all I see are my own mistakes. So instead, when I read other people's stuff and I can see something that I feel like they got exactly where they needed to go, I think it's fantastic. So there's this great comic book author, Harvey Pekar. He's since passed away, but it's called Our Cancer Year. It was featured briefly in the movie American Splendor. And the comic book talks about this whirring noise that happens when you get an MRI. And when you get an MRI to see if there's anything going on or if cancer has spread to your brain or the upper part of your thorax, you get put into this machine and you have these huge magnetic turbines that are spinning to create a magnetic image of your head. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. We knew about it. We learned about it in med school. We learned about it in residency. I've never personally had the need for an MRI, thankfully, but he describes this whirring in a way that I actually used to relate to my patients later on. So after I read this comic book, some of my patients would be, terrified of going into an MRI machine again because they're claustrophobic and they don't like that sound. And I'm like, oh, does it sound like this magnetic whirring? The way he described it was like, imagine huge magnets attached to a whisk and it's beating just around your head. And they're like, that's exactly what it's like. That's why I'm freaking out. To me, that was a small example of this transcendent moment with comics for me personally. That's what resonated with me, like finding comic artists who just absolutely nail what they wanted to get.